Welcome to Annual Punditry, the international affairs podcast with a trough of takes on topics you might care about. I'm Eric.
I'm James.
It's nice to see you. It's been a while.
Been a minute, bud.
It's not that, we've been busy over the past year. It's just that, nothing's been worthy of our conversation for the past year on the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, what is a land war in Europe, right?
Exactly. That one is just over there happening. But we've been hibernating, waiting, and now the recent Hamas attacks and Israeli retaliation in Gaza have brought us to the podcast table. As the non-experts that we are, but not completely ignorant, I like to think.
It's funny because we both recognize that we're not experts in this region, but we're like, oh, Israel and Hamas, something's going on. Well, then we have to make a podcast about it.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
don't know. I don't think we're going to have earth-shattering foreign policy recommendations. I don't know. We might. You never know. But I think might be more so we're just trying to talk through this and clear a
Yeah,
couple things up, talk a little bit about more what it means for the region. But
yeah.
neither of us have a crystal ball, and neither of us, again, are experts in this region. So do
What's
do with that what
what's
you will, listener.
what's nice is that most of all the other content about this issue that one may consume is basically the same playing field that we are in terms of knowledge. Maybe some more, maybe a little less, maybe a lot less. So we decided that we will boldly go where everybody else is already gone and insert their takes on Israel-Palestine, the conflict, and it probably won't. Maybe it'll be a little spicy, maybe it won't, but we're gonna try to talk through it and see if we can figure it out. So we, as we think about this, James, would you say that this issue is simple or complicated?
You know, I hate to say anything simple for a chance. It certainly may feel like sometimes you only have a binary choice when it comes to the random person coming in off the street to ask you what do you think of the conflict. Sometimes it can kind of be like, all right, well, it's one or the other. It's a one or a zero. Do you support this side? Do you support that side? If you don't know and you're still thinking about it, silence is violence, and you didn't speak out. And I think in that way, some folks kind of think, oh, it's simple. These folks killed these folks, so I'm going to support these other folks. But it can really go to both sides, and uh, you know, I, it's one of those takes. You know when you write like a creative writing story or poetry when you're like in fifth grade and you look back at it when you're like 20 years old and you're like, wow, I was a dumb kid. I'll look back on this in 20 years and be like, I'm an idiot. I won't be wrong, but like, I don't know, Eric, what do you think?
uh, you know, I completely agree. There's certain narratives that really make it sound like it's simple from either side. And like you can what's been interesting for me is observing kind of on the left, American left conversation about this. You've got like Joe Biden, unfailing support for Israel. And then you have like a ton of the left that is, especially on social media, that's talking about, who largely have a worldview of oppressor and oppressed. And through that lens, Israel clearly has an advantage over Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, a small land area, and so they're able to just unleash their will of military might over them. And while Gaza rockets can be fired back toward Israel, is not nearly as technologically advanced as the Israeli military capacity. So in some ways, I understand completely the narratives of the left that take on this, Gaza's an open air prison and Palestinians are, less than second class citizens in that area of the world and restricting their travel and life opportunities. At the same time, to square the circle of the other narrative of Israel legitimacy and what it means for Jewish people to survive in a world where anti-Semitism isn't a new thing, something that's been around for a while. I mean, 19th century Russia, they weren't exactly awesome toward Jewish people, and that's obviously way before the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism is something that's been around for a long time, and so the ideology that is Zionism, it's not surprising that people came up with that in the late 19th century, and they were like, hey, there needs to be a place for Jewish people to be able to defend themselves and have autonomy and live in a space without anti-Semitism. And then there's a Holocaust in the 1930s. So it's like, it's not wild to me that a political movement could lead to something that like a state for Jews would then exist. And since then, since that was largely established, thank you to the British largely for that. And then afterwards, and we'll get into the post World War II stuff as it ties into the global context, but for Jewish people to feel safe in a world over a long period of time, it isn't surprising to me that many get into this narrative in space that they need a land for themselves, and then that they're also historically tied to after World War II. So many Jewish people were displaced, obviously, and couldn't necessarily go back to where they came from. And so that was, and I believe I read there's some like surveys done by the Allies as they were trying to help Jewish people after they were taken freed from the camps, was they want to go to Palestine. It was either like basically Palestine or a casket was the answer for some, because they couldn't go back to Poland or Eastern Europe. So it's just a complicated situation. No matter how you cut it, you can cut it to be simple, you can cut it to be complicated, and I personally fall into it's a hard situation, which is why it's not solved.
Yeah, it's also, and you kind of hit on this when we were talking just a little bit before, so I'd like to bring it up now. But would sometimes you put yourself in the average citizen's shoes of either an Israeli or Palestinian, and I don't think necessarily either one of them, their first thoughts on what should we do tomorrow would be, oh, let's go conduct this raid or let's go conduct this missile strike and stuff like that. Um, you know, a lot of folks are just trying to live their lives in each of these countries, but sometimes decisions are just made by a very small group of people, and that leads to escalation and conflicts. And not all of leaders' interests are always aligned with the citizens' interests, and um, the general citizen, I guess. So it's just another thing to kind of put in there in terms of a lot of these folks are getting caught up in the crossfire when really they were just trying to. Would they really care, one way or the other, like what this land would be classified as long as they can go about it, have a family, and ensure a successful life for their family, and so on. So it's just I just wanted to bring it up because I know you were talking a little bit about how those folks are getting the moderates of this situation get caught up in the crossfire and become collateral damage.
Yeah, I when I think about this, there are some questions, and we've talked about legitimacy of a state or legitimacy of a government on this podcast before, if you go through the archive. But but we are operating on the fact that Israel is a legitimate state. And other than completely dismantling that, we have to move forward with Israelis and Palestinians occupying the same-ish area until one or the other or another group decides that the other shouldn't exist. So since the world has, and after World War II, there was the UN was like, we're basically taking a vote on the partition of this area, and it passed, and not without contention, but the United Nations agrees that Israel has legitimate stake to being in this area, even though they're, a settler colony, like they weren't there. And then an influx of immigrants over a relatively short time span, just less than a century, go from, 1890s, 1900s, and then obviously after World War II is a huge influx. So since we agree that they have legitimacy to be there, we have to move forward with that. And there was some progress on that with the normalization of, first with Egypt back in the day, and which pissed off some of the neighbors. But more recently, I think UAE has officially normalized relations with Israel, and Saudi Arabia is close. So
they were in talks. They were supposed to. This attack happened right in the midst, or right before, a key talk with Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations.
Yeah, and so that change would be a huge, and as Hamas and Palestinians largely is a Sunni Muslim population. Saudi Arabia is the not just Sunni Muslim, but of all Islam, one of the most holy and respected places in the world and significant places in the world. And so the fact that Saudi Arabia can normalize relations with Israel would be a huge sea change in how that area would operate. And so I think a lot of analysts were pivoting away from the Middle East as these normalization talks were happening. And then, but instead of that region kind of turning down in temperature, and, the Hamas attacks were in the works for a long time. So the normalization of Saudi Arabia maybe wasn't a huge factor in it, but the increased normalization of Israel in the region is now more uncertain than in the past with the attacks.
We were so close to getting countries to put different things away for them to kind of say, all right, let's just go get rich together. So close.
So close. MBS is like, Mohammed bin Salman's like, we're about to build this amazing city of like 1 million people in this strip mall indoor thing that'll house like 1 million people, and it'll be completely sustainable and amazing and completely out of touch with what can possibly be done. And they needed Israeli expertise for something, I don't know, but on that. But yeah, very close. And then the attack probably, because you never know. I mean, while the scope of the Hamas attack is greater than anything they had done before, there's a chance that as time goes on, a few months from now, a year from now, a couple of years from now, it may be back at the same place as it was prior to the attacks, with normalization in the region, or not.
It's It's weird. There's been kind of two thoughts that keep coming through my head on this conflict, and you can kind of see it in other conflicts as well. But it's this sense of just non-resolution. You still have these embers firing below the surface for a conflict. Why are you surprised when it catches fire at some point? Right. And that's one way to think about it. The second way to think about it is this conflict as a barrier. And you don't break it down the first try, but you keep cracking away at it and cracking away at it and cracking away at it. And eventually you'll actually bust through that barrier. But I don't know which one, right? Is this, do you practice strategic patience in conflicts like this and play the longer game and kind of hope that, through a couple more of these cycles, maybe generations, maybe eventually we'll get to a spot where everyone's just sick of killing each other, or, does there have to, or maybe there's one side that just completely dominates the other at some point. Um, you know, I don't know, but to me, I've kind of landed on the side of this ember, this fire burning underneath the surface. And why are we surprised when it comes up in flames? Why are we surprised when Russia invades Ukraine after fucking around in Crimea for 6 years? Why are we surprised? Why are we going to be surprised when China tries something on Taiwan after they've done so many operations and had all this rhetoric, and you have this, again, conflict kind of burning underneath the surface? It's an unresolved conflict. So it's still a conflict.
Yeah.
People are actively on both sides trying their best to achieve their interests in this.
Yeah. It just, that you saying that reminds me of some of the unprecedented global events that we've had in the past few years. So obviously COVID-19, old news. But I mean, land war in Europe, that was a pretty big thing to happen. Um, and then this attack on Israel, which obviously not out of nowhere, but the um, the pretty stark statistic that is the largest casualty event of Jewish people since the Holocaust, and which is a pretty sombering note to be on.
I will say, just I know you said it wasn't really a surprise in that sense, but from an intelligence point of view, it is very, Israel didn't know what was going on. Apparently, Hamas went back to dodging telecommunications intercepts by going back to pen and paper to set up this thing. So they had a very much a tactical surprise and stuff.
Yeah, which is, it was incredible that it was caught so many people by surprise. And so the greater context of this and in the region, and to kind of piggyback off, before we get into that, actually, to piggyback off what you said about the embers, and how they light up again, makes you think. This my view on the local struggle of Israel and Palestine, is that going back to the moderate Israelis, moderate Palestinians, are largely, held to the will of the whims of their most hardline people. So Israelis are held to hardline Israeli government officials like Bibi Netanyahu, who would believe that the Israeli state must basically expand, use offense as defense in Israel and outside of Israel to ensure their security. And they will never be safe, and they must always push. And that kind of gets into a tenet of Zionism that is kind of played in like is a thread throughout the decades, is that Israel basically feels that they are always under attack, and so therefore they must always have a posture of aggressiveness toward their neighbors, immediate and far away. And so while many Israelis have showed in protest that they don't agree with this and they dislike this policy, they're held to hardliners who occasionally get enough power to carry out assassinations and attacks and expand settlements in the West Bank and all of these things that those hardliners say that if we don't do this, we will be exterminated. It's basically a matter of survival that we are aggressive like this. And so then on the other side, you have the moderate Palestinians who, they don't like Hamas. Hamas has tactics that they don't like, or they don't provide enough economic opportunity, help facilitate enough economic opportunity, as like half the adults in Gaza are unemployed, and it's much more complicated than that. But to put it simply, the Hamas is largely stood as somewhat of a government entity, but is not willing to negotiate with the Israeli government. They're more focused on military action. And then, of course, there's the Iran element in all of this, whether they're more directly funding and giving supplies to Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and then they have had a relationship with Hamas as well. And it's not in Iran's interest for peace in Israel. They've never shown that they care about Palestinians in Gaza, but they care that Israel feels pain. And so how do they do that? They do that by having a relationship with Hamas, and their goals align, and therefore Israelis and Palestinians both suffer because of these greater powers asserting themselves. But Iran, they're just doing what Iran does, they're just out there doing their thing.
It is weird. I think General Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration, said that Iran was the biggest threat to start a peer-to-peer conflict with the U.S. And you can see why. And it's not necessarily that it's just Iran. It's that there's so many little proxy things going on in the Middle East here that can lead to escalation so quickly. It almost reminds you of World War I with like different alliance structures, except it might not necessarily be with certain states. It's like non-state alliance structures with proxy state alliance like groups. It's all over the place, and how quickly this can escalate into a full-blown conflict that the U.S. could very well, if you're in the State Department, you're looking at this very seriously, making sure that the right diplomatic moves are made. And if you're in DoD, you're making sure that you're not escalating it to a point to where everyone thinks, or people misjudge what you're going to do. But at the same time, you need to reassure allies. It's a tricky time, and it's so tricky because it's so tricky because of the factors involved. The important factors. But it is a tinderbox. Everybody has to, carefully think out what they're going to do because of it. But I think today, don't want to date this podcast too much, but fast moving situation. So this is Friday on the 27th, and Israel has started its ground operations into the territory, and so it's just another step along that way. We need to focus on how Hezbollah is going to react to this. Focus on how the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps supports any of those actors or further threatens the U.S. And It's
We
no,
love
no one's
parallels to World War One, you know?
dude. Who doesn't, man? That's everyone likes to watch World War II movies and stuff. Dude, World War One was the goat in terms of everything looking like a chessboard. Really a risk board, but
Truly, and World War One it was a little too messy for people. You know, it was the edgy one, not clean in the way that like the you know, the bad guys and how the war played out was just so cut and dry with World War Two. With World War One, it was, you know, you sympathized with each side and their struggles for during that conflict.
security. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, yes. So it would seem as though, and I'm glad that you know timestamped our conversation, but the U.S. military action to move aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean seems to have played. Other groups seem to be hesitant to act. Hezbollah was just like, we'll just do our trademarked thing and lob some missiles and not escalate further. Um, so it seems as though, for right now, that other folks don't seem to be seizing this opportunity to pile on and expanding the conflict, which is great. You know, it wouldn't be good. I would say. I think we can all agree. We can all agree that war is bad, and
Yeah.
a
I
bigger
mean,
one is a no go.
just think about like what two 2 years ago, or if you really want to rewind, go back to like 2020, 2019, where you have a fine economy, no pandemic, and then looking at your three peer competitors of the time period. Right now, now you fast forward, and we're pretty much arming the Ukrainians right now against Russia. Uh, we're completely at odds with Iran over this conflict, and it could lead to escalation. And Li Keqiang, the Chinese foreign minister, or former foreign minister, who everyone else thought was kind of a more moderate and experienced foreign policymaker, got fired and then died of a heart attack randomly at midnight last night.
Oh,
Some folks say he was healthy. I don't know.
people are saying that.
Wait for the facts to come out. But just like that, you got to start thinking. You're kind of on the edge of war with a lot of folks. Whether that proxy wars aren't cheap either.
No, they're not. No, they are not. So yeah, a lot of what in 2019, many things, you know, geopolitical and other type of aggression and conflict that, you know, the world had largely thought were over, popping up real nicely. That mindset has aged like a fine wine. That I don't want to drink out of. So,
Dude, do you remember the end of history in 2000? Francis
yeah,
Fukuyama. We're done, guys.
yeah,
The end.
like capitalism
It's
won.
peace. It's peace from here on out.
We're right. Our system is the best. Now we all know, and we're going straight to the Jetsons now. And our political and global institutional organizational structures are flawless, and we'll just go on and it'll all be great.
Yeah.
So to kind of sum up where we started and where we're at now in this conversation is that we don't have a solution to propose, and I think it's safe to say that this is an extremely complicated situation that You can sympathize with many different struggles in this conflict, and as a couple schmucks that are kind of informed, maybe communicated to you in a way that was coherent, maybe not, that it's just something that a conflict that we may see an end to in our lifetime, and we may not. And if we do see an end to it, it may be peaceful or it may be extremely sad. And we just don't know what's going to happen. And if the past decades are any indicator, is that this is a turnip of heat that will just eventually turn back down and will likely go back to the status quo that is just no good for anybody. And until it pops off again. So
Yeah. And just for everyone else out there, keep your research notes. You'll need them in like 2 years because something terrible is going to happen again in this conflict because, again, it simmers and it
yep,
comes back up. And so you don't have to start from square one anymore.
yep. It's a difficult one. Like whether you want democratized one state or a two-state solution. Two-state feels pretty dead. Uh, One state democracy, how much political influence Palestinians can have is up to debate. How that can be done exactly. But in the immediate post-World War II era, the Western world was pretty down to take ex-British colonies or I don't recall the exact relationship that Israel or the Brits had with the Palestinian era after World War One. But basically, taking areas and splitting them up, it worked really well in India with Pakistan. People had a great time just walking past each other, and no one died. No horrific atrocities there. And then trying to partition the Israel and Palestine, maybe back in the day, it wasn't an awesome idea to basically leave these places. Well, one, entering these places in the way that they did, but mostly leaving the places was just kind of like, oh, they're pretty ugly exits and arbitrary lines are drawn. Political and other social factors not really considered, and governments are empowered that ultimately lead to not great outcomes for people in the long term. Some places have, largely in Africa, have, not done great. Some have done better in the colonial exit, but it's just something that is ugly in the modern nation state construction that we are living in. But to move on to our next segment, we have a day in history, which James has for us. I'm excited.
Yeah. So, oh man, I got caught between two. So I'm just gonna give you both of them. So, in order, the first one was on this day in history in 1775. King George III spoke before both houses of British Parliament to discuss the growing concern of the rebellion in America, saying,
Oh,
quote, many of these unhappy people may still retain their loyalty and may be too wise not to see the fatal consequence of this usurpation and wish to resist it. Yet the torrent of violence has been strong enough to compel their acquiescence till a sufficient force shall appear to support them. And with those words, he got Parliament's okay to dispatch troops against his own subjects. So a little blood here, a little blood there will help out those unhappy people.
yep.
Tune
Yep.
in next time to see how that worked out. And in the second one, to end on a bit of a hopeful note in terms of conflicts that could lead to war and between two sides that seem vehemently opposed. Today marked the anniversary of the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Hey.
So this was yesterday. Khrushchev was turning around his Soviet ships bound for Cuba, which of course the U.S. had imposed a barricade, naval blockade, and he turned them around, sent a letter to the president, reaching an agreement to send ships again, but promised there were no nuclear armaments on there, or armaments of any kind. And over the next day, they were able to come to a compromise, which eventually led to the missiles being removed, and also the missiles being removed by the United States from Turkey, which was obviously near Soviet Union territory. So, yeah, just a little piece.
That is uplifting. Yeah. I also love that King George III was just like, we have these, these unhappy English folk that need help in this other land. Then Putin's just like, we have Russians in this other land that need help. Great way to sell movement of.
It rhymes.
Yep.
It rhymes.
Yeah, it's thank you very much for those. It was great. Two very relevant and great days of history that we have.
All right. Well, on this rate of podcast episodes, thank you for listening, folks. I'll probably see you in about a year and a half or so.
Year and a half. We'll see what happens. I felt like if we're going to wade into any discussion that's least problematic, where the things that we can say will age perfectly forever, it seemed like this was the time. So to, the literal almost dozens of people that streamed this on YouTube, we appreciate your patronage and patience as we've been off, but sponsor hasn't changed. Still have the crisp, cold, refreshing hams. And so I am in the land of sky blue waters now, and I gotta say, there's something about a warm day and having a hams, I will say. Do you have access to that in the big city now?
I haven't seen one yet. I haven't seen one in the wild yet.
Okay, there's got to be a bodega that has that. You can grab a breakfast sandwich and a ham, some breakfast beer, breakfast sandwich, bring them together.
Yeah, absolutely. At either 8 a.m. or 3 a.m. They hit the same.
Well, thank you very much for tuning into Animal Punditry, and the new episode sometime. And we look forward
when China invades Taiwan.
And I knocked on wood, so that definitely won't happen now. And we'll see you all later.